Hi. How are you all? Thanks for coming out. 10 years ago, I finished Columbine. That took me 10 years to research and write, and I was like, oh, thank God, that's done. And after recovering from the second bout of secondary PTSD, which I had no idea was a thing. I mean, who knew? But it's a horrible thing. And getting through that, I was just like at a huge sigh of relief that that's done and I can move on to other things and never have to do that again. So what the hell is this? I did not foresee this. In fact, I swore I would never do another book on anything like this, and I meant it. And not only, after I finished Columbine, that was the third or fourth time that I had, done that huge sigh of relief. The first one being a month out when I finished a really big piece for Salon.com that I spent a month on. And I was like, thank God, okay, that's done. And every time I meant it. But I really had no idea. And really, 20 years ago, driving out Highway 6 to the mountains, looking for this school I'd never heard of, Columbine High. And this is during the first 45 minutes of the shooting in a suburb called Littleton that I had never heard of. I lived in Denver, but I didn't know. I was a transplant. I went to grad school in Boulder, and I didn't know these, suburban places. So I'm looking for this place, and I had no idea that it was like literally driving my life into a completely different direction that was never going to be the same, and what I was in for. But also, sometimes I feel like, my journey is like kind of a metaphor. Okay, I just use one cliche per day, so I just use the first one up. But really, but it really has been, and I had no idea that it was sort of a metaphor from what the country is going through. I doubt any of you guys knew, even on the day Columbine happened, as horrible as it was, where we would be 20 years later, that they would keep happening and that they would get worse. That Columbine, I hate the scorekeeping the media does, but there's one that I think is really powerful. Columbine is no longer in the top 10. And it's still a seminal one that unfortunately set so many of the rest of them, all the rest of them really in motion, but it's gotten that much worse. And it's continuing to get so much worse that, I can't keep track now how many, the last 2 or 3 years, however long it's been, 3 of the 5 worst ones have been in the last 3 to 5 years, including the worst ever, obviously Las Vegas. What are we, about 2 years out or less, I guess. We're not even at the second anniversary. And Pulse, I think, which hit me really hard, was just a couple days ago, the anniversary. So I didn't realize what we were in for or what role I would play in it. And I think 17 years in, I did an epilogue for Columbine where I went back, and there's sort of 5 parts of the epilogue. And I think, I meant to check this morning, one of them was called, I think, Colliding Orbits. And I talked about, I didn't actually mention this particular one, which I will here, but that's what I realized. I was drawn into these different orbit, this strange orbit with all these different people. And actually the 3 of us, it's the most interesting and odd to me, is Sue Klebold, Connie Sanders, and me. We're all friends, especially like Connie. I'm close with Connie, and Connie's close with Sue, and I'm friendly with Sue. I know her. We don't talk all the time. We're not friends, but we're definitely friendly. And so that's the mother of one of the shooters, the daughter of the only adult teacher who died heroically saving kids, Dave Sanders, and then the writer who sort of told their stories and tried to bring it together. And what a weird combination that we're all close. I actually introduced the 2 of them about 16 or 17 years out, because Sue had told me, basically, she said, I know you talk to all these people, and if any of them feel the need to talk to me, I can, I'm open. And around the same time, I was talking to Connie, and she's like, oh, I'd really like to talk to that woman. Partly, especially, Connie really wanted to let her know that it was okay, that she didn't blame her. And several of the parents feel that way, not all of them. But really had a need to get together. We all have different parts in this. And I felt bad about even including myself, but Connie is always the one to let me know. It's like, we're in this together. We came in different ways, but it doesn't matter. We all have different roles to play in this. And she also gives me permission to sort of like, well, they all do, really. I used to feel really guilty about even talking about my PTSD issues because it felt really idiotic and trivial compared to theirs. But Kiki Leba, who's also one of the Columbine survivors I know really well, was a teacher who's still there. He was in his first year teaching that day. If you've read Columbine, he's the one who was being interviewed by Mr. D at his office, what had happened. He likes to say that grief is not a competition. And we all have different ways it affected us for different reasons. And your body doesn't care and your mind doesn't care. It's like saying like, oh, I don't have, the right to have, diabetes or feel bad about it. Like, well, your body has other ideas. You do or you don't. But so that's how I got involved in this and stayed involved in it. And, I say to Connie that like, well, I'm the only one of us that, did this willingly, chose this and can get out anytime I want. And now she kind of laughs. She's sort of like, you're never getting out of this. And I guess, I have the right, I could if I wanted to, but only if I didn't have a conscience. Because I feel at this point, we all do have a role to play in it. And I didn't really know what my role would be until I think a key change happened, I guess about 8 years out. I was invited to a scholarly conference by this group, the Academy of Critical Incidents, that was based out of University of Virginia. Now it's out of John Jay College in New York. And now I'm on the board of it. But I had no idea 12 years ago or so when they invited me to this conference at Virginia Tech. And I was trying to finish up Columbine. I was in a race then to get it done for the 10th anniversary and didn't have time for a 3-day conference. But it was really compelling, too, because they were going to go to Virginia Tech on campus and meet with a lot of the survivors who never talk to press anymore, if ever, and a lot of about 24 academics and renowned shrinks and people who specialize in all sorts of things. And I didn't have time for this, but I made a decision which I've became a thing since then, is like when really super smart people invite you to something, go. Even if you don't have time and it doesn't work and there's like other priorities, just like make time for that. And it really was crucial because I got to know, some firsthand survivors, who made it through that building from a completely different tragedy and got different perspectives and met people from all different and bonded with different people of expertise. And over the years, I've developed this cadre of sources, which is such a powerful thing for a journalist or any kind of writer, that I didn't know what was happening until, especially after the book came out, but even before that, when these shootings would occur, they would include me on their email chains. And there were, FBI profilers, and especially former FBI profilers, and different renowned shrinks from around the world who are experts on this stuff. And they would sort of hash out what's going on here. What do we know about this? Or what do we think the larger picture? And they were including me, and partly for my thoughts, but really to then sort of like be their messenger. And it was never anything formal, but often the discussion would go in different directions, and I would ask at first sort of like embarrassing questions or things that I was afraid to ask. But I'd also seen I had a lot of perspective, and I'd talked to a lot of people. I'd been out in the field so much more than any of them. So I brought some things to the table too, but often we had these really powerful conversations that were not happening in the media. And so then I would sort of bring them to the media. Mary Ellen O'Toole, who's probably the greatest profiler in the FBI's history, she's now retired. You may see her on CNN or MSNBC now. She's just freaking brilliant. And she headed the FBI Not Columbine proper, their report on all school shootings. And she created the Leesburg Summit that's mentioned in Columbine, where she brought these experts around the world. And she couldn't talk to me at any point during the book because she was still working for the FBI. But now that she's retired, she does. And she's a professor now, but and she edits a scholarly magazine. But she had a piece that she ran by me about, I don't know how it came about injustice collectors, which is a term they use all the time for a certain time, usually psychopaths, really horrible killers and other people. And I thought it was really fascinating, and I ended up doing a piece for the New Republic for it. I did sort of like the more mainstream version, and then I did a lot more research and found out something she hadn't. But when they have these ideas, they sort of percolate, and then like I take them out to the world. But what also does is sort of like inform me. So after every one of these events, I've also got the worst job in journalism, which is sort of like the go-to murder guy, the mass murder guy, especially after school shootings, but sometimes after other mass murders, where they call me. I mentioned in the book, God, I forget the exact quote, but it's in my phone, so I looked it up to use it there. I found out Parkland happened about 30 minutes into it before we knew when he was dead, because one of Anderson Cooper's producers that I work with all the time texted me and said, "Another fucking school shooting. Can you come in tonight?" And I live in New York, so just walk over there. But so that's my thing. And for the first several years of this, I kept thinking every time it happened, like, well, I don't know what I'm going to say. What am I going to say this time? What's going to be different? But it turns out there always is something useful and interesting and different to talk about. But it's because behind the scenes, I'm talking to all these sort of experts, people, and developing these different ideas and hashing them out. So that's been my whole role in this over the years, and that's what really set up Parkland. But I also have these rules because I had the 2 bouts of PTSD, secondary PTSD, which is somebody who doesn't witness something directly, but is still very close and gets impacted by it. So one of my rules is I'm not allowed to watch anything on television about any survivors or victims. I actually hold the remote with my thumb over the trigger button to hit pause or stop or mute, because that can do me in. I can do anything on the killers. That doesn't get inside me and hurt me. I thought with Columbine that would really unnerve me, but it didn't. It was the victims and the survivors that really tear me up. So that's one of the things. And I can go back to a place a year or 2 after the scene of a crime. Las Vegas, I kind of pushed it by going with the Academy group 6 months after, but never any sooner. So it has to be separated in either space or time to write about these things. So I was never allowed to go right back to the scene of the crime. And until Parkland, I threw that out the window. And the reason was, so the night it happened, I did Anderson's show, and then the next morning I did New Day on CNN, their morning show. And I was surprised. I expected to see Chris Cuomo out in the field. So I was really shocked when he was in the studio. He's a primetime show now, but he was hosting, and normally he would go to these events. And so I was shocked to see him in the studio, and I asked him about that. Why aren't you down there? And it turned out Ellison Camerata, is that how you say her name, was down there. And he said, I told him no. He said, they were booking my plane tickets, and they had me on the way yesterday, and I said, I'm not going again. I've been to these for, 19 years. There's never any change. We never do anything about it. It's pointless. I can't stand it. And I said, I'm not doing it anymore. At least I'm not doing this one. And I was like, wow, good for you. And I'd been thinking about that and toying with that idea for quite a few years. And I said right there and then, I've been thinking about that, and I think this is the time to, this is my last one. I'm gonna do a few more of these today, and then that's it. The universe has a really fun way of laughing at you. It wasn't even like when I got home, it was on the elevator ride down that changed. Because they have, at the CNN Center in New York, they have monitors on the elevator, so you can watch the show when you're riding up or down. And on the way down, I was on the same segment with David Hogg. And he was on right after me. And so on the elevator down, I saw that first famous speech where he sort of called out adult America that you're probably all familiar with, where he said, we are children, you're adults. Now I'm paraphrasing the rest, but basically he said, you have failed us. You have let us down and you need to do something. This has been 19 years, this is ridiculous. We are dying. We weren't even born yet when Columbine happened. You've had a whole generation to solve this so we don't die and you're letting us die. Now I'm totally paraphrasing there, but that was the gist of what he said. And it was about an 8-minute interview. I stayed in the elevator. It's from the 5th floor. It's about a 20-second ride. And I just stayed on the elevator and watched that whole thing because I could not believe what I was hearing. First of all, I've been doing this for 19 years, and I know what first-day trauma survivors sound like. And they don't sound like that. And this was still within 24 hours, and of course he hadn't slept, so it was still the first day for him. And I was like, this is weird. So I thought he was one in a million and one of a kind. Then I got home, and I just saw a parade of them on television. I'm like, what the hell? So by noon, I was doing a piece for Politico about, is this time different, and why is this time different? And then on Saturday, I'm a freelancer, but I do a lot of pieces for Vanity Fair. And my editor there called me and said, I know you're not allowed to go down, because he's a good friend of mine, and I know you're not allowed to go down, but would you go down? And so I was like, oh God, I was like, maybe. And I never tell this part, I didn't put this part in the book. The other reason is because I guess that same day shortly after the interview with Chris Cuomo, while I was working on the Politico piece, Anderson's producer called me up and said, hey, what if I put you on a plane and, you co-hosted the show with Anderson tonight? And I was like, wow, I'm not allowed to, but maybe. And so I decided okay, yes, so I won't have to be there. I could just, on the air for an hour, and then I can come back. Okay, I'll do that. But I already agreed to shows with other networks in between, and I couldn't make the flight without sort of, screwing them. And so we decided not to. But because I'd sort of also already made the mental half step, then when he called, I said, okay. But I knew, one of the conditions was I'm not going to go to document either murderers or the horror of murder. I can never do that again. I don't want to, anybody who wants to write a book about that, fine. But I'm going to go down there because it seems like something is different this time. Something is happening, something really powerful, where this may really be different. So I'm going to go down there to cover that. Would you like me to write about that? He's like, yes, definitely. That's what we want you to do. So I'm like, fuck the murders. It's like, I don't care. And even the grief and the pain, that's happening, but that's not what I'm there to do. So that was the other thing. So I was going to write about doing something about this. And that's what I did do. And I had no idea, I had no intention of doing a book. Thank you. I had no intention of doing a book, but I was in search of great characters because they contracted me to do, this is the first time this ever happened, but, I was also 4 years late, something like that, on my Gay Soldiers book that I've been working on off and on since the year 2000. I've been tracking these two guys since they were captains during the height of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I've been following them half their lives. And that book was about 3/4 done, almost all researched. But it was quite late. And so I couldn't, and actually I just created a schedule where I was gonna get it done by the end of the year. And so I agreed with my Vanity Fair editor, okay, I'm gonna go for 5 weeks. They had just announced the march Sunday morning while we were working this out, that they were gonna just march on Washington. And I was thinking oh, can they really pull that off in 5 weeks? But I said, okay, that's an ending point. I'll go for 5 weeks. And the deal was I was gonna write 3 to 5 pieces for the web and co-produce a mini documentary they were doing on it. And that would be the deal. So one of the first things I was in search of good characters, which is always crucial to any story. And I don't care if it's a newspaper article or a book or a series or a television show. Characters are characters and story are the two main things, at least for me. And it's finding the right people. So I was in search of really interesting people, and I knew right away, obviously I wanted to do the stars that were already stars, Emma Gonzalez, David Hogg, and Cameron Kasky. But I was much more interested in the people who weren't stars, but should be, who were sort of like behind the scenes playing crucial roles, but we hadn't seen. I figured there had to be some people like that. And then also sort of some people on the fringes. Somebody who was part of this and involved, but wasn't central to it in some way, playing some interesting role. I always tell people, like, if I were doing a book on Bruce Springsteen, I would, a roadie would be a thing, or maybe the accountant, if, we happen to be some weird relationship or whatever. But somebody who's like, can see it all happening and is an eyewitness to everything, but doesn't have the responsibility and has a different perspective than you would think and can see things differently. So somebody like that, whatever it is. So those are kind of the characters that I kind of always do. And had an eye lookout for different pieces. The other thing with Vanity Fair was if it worked out, it would develop, then I would do a longer piece for the magazine too over several months. And that would have a long lead time. So it would have to be, it could be less newsy because it would take, months to do. And so I would need stories and characters with more staying power and something that, other people hadn't done. But I always try to do that anyway. In fact, there's a picture that I kind of hated because I looked like an idiot, but that they used when I did do a piece for the magazine. I mean, I guess maybe this, I never talk about this, but maybe style does sum up my style. So they use this as my author photo on the contributors page. There's a picture of me at the launch of their summer tour that they did across America in Chicago at the Peace March. And so there was like this, this huge march and event that Jennifer Hudson and Chance the Rapper came and the Parkland kids spoke. There was this huge to-do with thousands of people came. And there's a picture of me on the media riser with all these banks of cameras and all these reporters, facing the stage. And I'm sitting on the side of the riser, literally facing in the opposite direction. And with like a notebook like this in my lap, and I'm like scribbling down. Because I think that's where the stories are. Jennifer Hudson's great and all, but like I wasn't gonna like do my piece on her. And like she sang Amazing Grace, which was really wonderful. And I might include a line of that in the story, but like, I'm not writing about her. I'm writing about the people there and the audience. And I was much more interested in the fact that this was, I think, the 10th year of the Peace March in Chicago, in a really shitty neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Which the name just escapes me, but it's St. Sabina's Church. And it's sort of a take back our neighborhood rally that they do. It's the first Friday after high school graduation, and then every Friday night, where the people in the neighborhood march through the neighborhood to let drug dealers and gangs and so forth know we're taking this back, and we're here too. And it's a really powerful thing, and it's become a huge deal on the south side of Chicago. And there were maybe 3,000 people there. And I knew this was the biggest they'd ever had, but also it was obviously like, it was about 2/3 white people. And I pretty much assumed that like, they'd never seen more than, 1 or 2 or 0 white people at these before. And so like, that was my first question of all like the locals who were there, like, how do you feel about all the white people here? Like, is that fantastic? Is that kind of insulting that like, the white kids from Parkland came, and now like, oh, we all care about this, and now they care about this too? Or what? How do you feel about that? So, that was one of the big questions, and I had to figure out sort of how to ask it. But the answer, by the way, is that, yeah, in some ways it is a little insulting, but that's okay. We'll take it. I think is kind of the African American community in America in general on these sorts of things is like, we'll take what we can get. And if it takes, a telegenic girl like Emma Gonzalez to make the white people care about kids in America getting murdered by guns, and to bring you to Chicago and to do this, well, and thank God for Emma Gonzalez, and hopefully maybe you'll come back. But that was a big question for me. And so those were the stories are. Anyway, I'm getting way off track from what I wanted to talk about. So let me. I want to save time for some questions. So let me just tell you about three of those characters who maybe you haven't heard of: Jackie Corin, Daniel Duff, and Alex Jones. And so the three stars that I knew I wanted to talk about. Well, actually, I'm going to jump ahead. One thing I forgot with David Hogg. Something really interesting happened that first Sunday after Parkland, the day they announced the March for Our Lives. I got a hold of David Hogg, and he put me on speakerphone with the whole group. They were at Cameron's house, and we chatted for about 10 or 15 minutes. And so David was the first one I talked to, and he was just this delightful kid. And you know, if I had to like put down a list of adjectives of describing him at the time from that phone conversation, it would be like whip smart, intelligent, silly, playful. How many here are familiar with David Hogg? And how many of you would sort of like use an adjective like playful or silly to describe David Hogg? Me either. So when I later met David Hogg in person, those adjectives did not fit. The smart really fit. But I mean, the big things were like angry, just like burning. In fact, I interviewed him 29 days out because it was the day before the 1-month anniversary school walkouts. And there had already been several profiles written by him. One I think was titled "David Hogg is Angry" in giant block letters. And he was. And he told me, he told me during the interview, like, I'm just an angry person. And he called himself a nihilist and said, I've always been this way and blah, blah, blah. And I kept thinking, you weren't a month ago when I met you over the phone. You were such a different guy. And he got angrier I spent an hour with him at his kitchen table, and he got angrier the whole time. And I kept thinking, is talking to me about this making you angrier? Because I think it is. And talking to all of us. So luckily his mom came home. She's a school teacher. Just after, and his dad was there, and then David left. Actually, he biked over to do the 60 Minutes interview, and I spent the afternoon with them. And once I got to know them, I bounced that off, and I said, David told me he's just an angry person. And his mom, Rebecca, who's a character, and just will say whatever comes into her head. She just laughed. She's like, no, he's not angry. He's angry about this. He's been angry for the last month. Yes, this is making him really angry, but he's not an angry kid. That's not who he's been. I was like, that's kind of what I thought. And then I talked to, generally I ask the same question of everyone, or perspective that I can get when it's a key question. So I asked the question of most of his friends over the next couple of weeks. And when I asked Jackie Corin, who he'd only met because of this, she's now pretty much running March for Our Lives. I asked her then, what she thought about that. She's like, no. And she actually showed me a video of David vamping and looking incredibly silly. And she said, but to be honest, I only met that David about a week ago, too. So 3 weeks into it, and she actually used that phrase. I'm like, I checked it that she meant what I thought she did. And she's like, yeah, we didn't know each other. We were both kind of outsiders to most of these kids who were mostly Cameron's friends from drama club. And David didn't show that side of himself at first. I mean, the other thing that you probably don't know about David is he's really a huge introvert. He's fairly comfortable talking to speeches and being a debater and doing this. But he's a quiet, shy person who's trouble opening up to people. So it took him several weeks, and he didn't show that side. So one of the things that I also went into the story with, one of the things I wanted to figure out and tell in my Vanity Fair stories and then the book is that everybody here knows these kids from TV and from Twitter and knows these personas. And sort of the most important question for me is that picture accurate? Is that the real kids? Are we actually seeing the real TV, or is it manufactured, or is it something else? And what I found out is, yes, it's all true, but it's just a slice of the truth. And you'll see this with all the characters if you read the book, but particularly with David, it was very obvious that the angry David is a real, completely authentic part of David, but it's just one slice of David. And it's not the most dominant slice in his life of his personality. So it is true, but this makes that piece come out, and that's the part that you see. And that's true with all of them. Now, the other ones that I want to talk about just really briefly is Jackie Corin. And I started the book with her. And she's sort of the hero of the book. And there's about 8 or 10 central characters, but she's sort of like the first among many. And she's kind of the implementer. And I'll just give you like the one-liner just description on her. Jackie Corn is a petite blonde teenager with fair skin, flowing hair, and a soprano voice that doesn't carry in crowds. But she has a presence. She was the junior class president at the time. Now she just graduated, the senior class president of a big high school, 3,300 kids, for a reason. She's this natural sort of implementer and gets things going. And Cameron Kasky, who started the whole thing in his living room, he likes to say, thought of like in his Star Wars pajama on the toilet, he thought of the never again thing. He's a very silly, playful kid. He realized very early on that like, he brought all his drama friends and certain other people together. He had this incredibly creative group. And he realized on Friday, so 2 days into it, he needed a few non-creatives. And he had a bunch of actors and collaborators and like, if you have writers, if you know people like that, we will never get anything done. We would never put on the show. What he needed was a producer. So he called like the best implementer he knew, the class president, he was also a junior, his class president, and a friend of his, Jackie Corn, and she's a freaking producer. She gets stuff done. And later I asked Cameron's mom, her first impression of the kids. She, by the way, she was on a cruise at sea in the Caribbean when this happened. Cameron called her and let her know, and she said, I heard the word active shooter and then everything else is a fog. But she couldn't get back here right away. So it took till Saturday for her to get, this is all March for Our Lives sprang to life in her living room where she was not present for the first 3 or 4 days. So she got back Saturday while they were in the midst of it, right before they left to where Emma was going to give we call BS speech, that was going to make her famous. So I asked Natalie, Cameron's mom, like, what were her first impressions of the kids? And she said 2 kids that stood out. Emma, because she's just magnetic and was. And then Jackie was different because like Jackie, she didn't literally have a clipboard, but she was like the kid with a clipboard going around like, okay, these are great ideas. Now we got to pick 3 of them. And we need a schedule and we need plans and we need a budget. We need all these things. She was already making it happen. So we got all these creative kids and then like, she's like the behind the scenes. When I was talking to her early on, I was like, so you're sort of like the COO of this. And she's 17. She never heard of that term. And I'm like, oh, chief operating officer. Still never heard of it. But then I explained what it was. And she's like, oh, yeah, I guess that's what I am. And then, Daniel Duff is just an outsider shoot. Now, I'm going to have almost no time for questions. So I'm going to give you the one-liner on him. He was a freshman who, I lost my book part. Well, he's like a cute little freshman who I met at the first Tallahassee trip. And I interviewed the kids first, and then I asked them, to spell their names and their year in school and all, and he said Daniel Duff, and freshman. And I was like, freshman? Like, he just had these, like, astounding things. Like, yeah, he was 14. He was about to turn 15 a week later. I was like, wow. So, like, okay, you might be a really interesting outsider. So he was. And then Alex Jones, who, not Alex Jones, sorry. Really different. Alex King, who I thought originally was one of the outsiders, but turned out to be evolved into being one of the central people who should have been a star. He was one of the African-American kids from Chicago. And early on, about 3 weeks out, I hadn't heard about this for quite a long time. There was a meeting where several black kids from Chicago flew down to Parkland and met at Emma Gonzalez's house with a bunch of the March for Our Lives kids and really changed the nature of the movement into being not just about school shootings, but about all gun violence against kids in America. And really the blight in our cities in Chicago, Baltimore, DC, Compton, and so forth, and made that equal sort of partners in this and equal partners with those kids. And Alex was one of the first kids that went down, and he described that first meeting. I asked him to describe it, and he said, well, we drove up and to this place, and I thought it was a resort. And then somebody said, like, the resident, I'm like, wait, she lives here? And I mean, he described it sort of like he was going to like Mar-a-Lago or something. And he said, and we drove up, and then, there was this huge window, which is also a door. And my first thought is like, can I walk on the grass? And then her mom came like running right down the lawn. And so and she hugged us and came back up. So like, okay, we followed her. And then when we got inside, my first thought was like, well, are you allowed to wear shoes in here? But then Emma came running around the corner. It was all smokes and smiles, and then everything was fine. And I was like, wow, I'm like, oh, I love this kid. And I immediately, my first thought is thinking like, I'm totally gonna use this, but like, is it okay to like portray this black kid from Chicago who's like never like, kind of afraid to do the wrong thing in the white person's house. And so I talked to him later, but by the time I talked to him, I knew it was okay because that's my reality. I'd never been to like a rich white person's house or an affluent, I didn't want to be the black thug from Chicago. And like, Alex is just for real. He's exactly what, and he's fine with that. That's the reality. And that's where these worlds were colliding. And I thought that was really interesting. And now he's a central person. When they won the International Peace Prize, it sometimes chokes me up, and they flew to Cape Town for Desmond Tutu to present it to them over Thanksgiving weekend. He compared them to some of the great peace movements in history. They took Alex with him because by then he was a key player in this. He's a wonderful kid. So, God, I got 2 or 3 minutes. So I got time for maybe 2 questions. I'll just leave it there. I went a little off. So who's got a burning question? Go ahead.
Have you seen the TED Talk, My Son Was a Columbine Shooter?
Oh, yeah. Have I seen the TED Talk, My Son Was a Columbine Shooter? Yeah. Sue Klebold, who I urge everyone to watch it. I wish it were longer. I think they have a limit, like 5 or 10 minutes or something. I could have watched that for an hour. It's brilliant. You should watch that. It's very powerful. Also, read her essay in O Magazine or her book. Who else? Go ahead.
How do you avoid falling into the trap of sensationalism without cutting out the dramatic appeal of the story?
Oh, how do I avoid the sensationalism? You mean in terms of the shooter or the kids? Or?
In terms of just the event itself, but mostly in terms of the shooter.
Okay. In terms of the event itself, but especially the shooter. I made a really conscious decision. It was easier this time because I didn't name the shooter. I refused to name him in the book, which, by the way, and I have I toyed with barely doing it. I think there's a page and a half where I do a really capsule history, or maybe 2 pages where his background and then a tick-tock of what happened that day, of how he walked into the building and what he did, and that's it in the entire book. So I sort of wrote him mostly out of it. And that was maybe the toughest decision of the book, or the one that was hardest at the beginning. I mentioned to my editor, who, by the way, if anybody's writers here, aspiring writers, Gail Winston at HarperCollins, she's at the Harper imprint, which is she's one of the grand dames of publishing. Amazing. If you get a chance, pick her. But it was great working with her. And luckily, I'd gone very far with the Gay Soldiers book with her, so we already had a relationship and a trust. And I'd given her a lot of pages and we talked, so I knew to trust her. But early on, I talked to her and I told her, I don't think I even want to mention him. And she's like, there were very few things in the book. She's a very good editor, working with you and trying not to impose her will. But early on, she said, okay, you want to think about that. Because she said, we want you to do the definitive book on Parkland. And there's a killer, He played a big role in this. And do you really want to do that? And even not using his name is it's if people are going to cite you or scholarly people and the name's not in there. She's like, just think about that one as you're doing it. So I did. And I really was torn back and forth about, but as I wrote it, it became very, very clear to me. And then to her credit, when I turned to the draft, she's like, oh, totally. Yeah, totally get it. Yeah, totally makes sense. And I wanted a statement of not naming him. Partly because I've been part of this movement for about 17 years ago. I wrote a piece for BuzzFeed about not naming the killers, and I got so much pushback from media. In fact, Jeff Greenfield, they had debate me on reliable sources on CNN, which was the most frustrating thing because he agreed with me on most things, yet was saying he was disagreeing with me. And was like, no, this is a terrible idea, and then agreed with it. And I'm sort of hear yourself. But I think the idea was still we can't self-censor, we can't blah, blah, blah. They've come around, and now it's really the norm. There was just a piece about it in a Media Watch piece the other day now, like this is pretty much the normal, like you limit the name and the showings. Okay, I gotta wrap it up. But anyway, at the time that was a novel thing, but when I first wrote this piece and after one of these murders, I was on an MSNBC show and brought it up. And they said, well, can we really do that? I said, I haven't mentioned his name this show. And they were like, really? Like, no, you didn't even notice. And I'd already made a policy for a couple of years. I haven't done it on any of these shows. You didn't even notice. You just call him the shooter, the gunman, the blah, 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 the perpetrator. Anyway, so I also wanted this to be sort of like a statement of I can write a freaking book about this and never say the guy's name. And a lot of journalists who interviewed me said, I probably wouldn't have even noticed if you didn't say it early on that you were doing that. So that was one thing. But as far as just not making the whole larger thing, I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the most important decisions I made in Columbine. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. And I'll tell you the way I thought about it. I decided the more, I don't know the right word, the more violent, the more intense, the more horrifying the scene, the quieter my voice needs to be. And just let it speak for itself. And that's really something I learned from my mentor, Lucia Berlin, who you should also read. She's now this amazing phenomenon many years after her death. Best-selling fiction writer that I learned from. But she really taught me that it will be louder if I'm quiet. And just understated. In Columbine, the climactic scene is the killer's suicides. And it's disgusting. And I worked with people who embalmers and stuff about how the eyes puckered up when they went back into the killing scene 40 minutes later to commit their own suicides. And I wanted to show you how disgusting it already was in that room and how bodies were already decomposing. And I gave you details of that, but just clinical, very understated. The eyes are puckering and doing this. But it speaks for itself. And so that was the technique that I used throughout the book. And you don't need to make them sensational. And I also I also thought Columbine was going to end with the murders in the library and then the suicides. And I realized there's already enough violence in this book. And I just didn't do the murders. I just referred to the fact and then went right to the suicides because I wanted to get you the fact that their suicides were utter failures in their eyes. And that's how they felt about it. That they had the school had not blown up as they intended. The bombs did not work out in the parking lot. And it was an act of desperation. And it was disgusting and horrible. And you can see by where they did it that there's all this gore in the library. And the last thing they did before the suicides was shoot out the window, probably suicide by cop, attempting to get killed because they didn't know what to do. Eric walked right through just the blood and gore, and Dylan walked all the way around it because there's only one entrance to the library. So we know where they came and we know which windows we choose. Dylan did not want to walk through that horror and went around it. And it was disgusting. And they died disgusting, miserable failures. So that's what I wanted to convey, but all that just did it by itself. I painted the room and let you just feel that for yourself. And that's what I tried to do throughout. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.